بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد, continuing in the chapters of Zadul-Ma'ad and Tahdhib al-Asma' wal-Lughat lil-Hafiz al-Nawawi, we had discussed the characteristics, the character of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how he behaved, the things that he would say, things that he wouldn't. And this is something that we've discussed at length throughout this series. And this is really the foundation, the crux of the book. Zadul-Ma'ad is a book about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it's a book about the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And at the beginning of Zadul-Ma'ad, there are in-depth chapters regarding his character, regarding the way that he spoke, the way that he sat, and so forth. And also extensive chapters regarding his physical characteristics, alayhi salatu wassalam. Last week, we concluded the chapters regarding his etiquette and character. This week, inshallah ta'ala, we're going to discuss his physical features and then transition into his ayat, meaning his miracles that were performed during his lifetime, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and after. يقول الحافظ النووي رحمه الله تعالى فصل في صفته صلى الله عليه وسلم. انتهينا من وصفه ومن وصف خلقه والآن في وصف خلقه صلى الله عليه وسلم، يعني كيف كان خلقا. يقول النووي كان صلى الله عليه وسلم ليس بالطويل البائن ولا القصير ولا الأبيض الأمهق ولا الآدم ولا الجعد القطط ولا السبط، وتوفي وليس في رأسه 20 شعرة بيضاء. An-Nawawi rahimahullah, he tells us that regarding the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's descriptions, he was very medium, very average in the majority of his descriptions. There were no extremes in any of his physical characteristics. He tells us that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam could neither be described as abnormally tall nor abnormally short. He was average in height. And this description of his height, how tall he was, this is contrasted and relative to his time. People's bodies were much bigger 1,500 years ago, but for his time, based on their characteristics, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam could neither be described as being very tall nor very short. Yet in spite of this, he was also described that in a gathering with other people around him, with other people of average height around him, he would seem to be taller than everyone. But he is neither extremely tall nor extremely short. Nor was he very pale, nor was he dark-skinned or tanned. He was between that. Neither very pale nor dark-skinned. And his hair as well was very medium, very average, meaning that his hair was neither very curly and coarse, nor was his hair extremely fine and straight. And Nawawi rahimahullah tells us that when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, he passed away not having more than about 20 white hairs in his beard and in his hair collectively. So, it's not that he, in his older age, his hair turned white or his beard turned white. There were just a few white hairs in his beard and in his hair collectively. وَكَانَ حَسَنَ الْجِسْمِ, and his body was very well proportioned and very well suited. بَعِيد مَا بَيْنَ الْمَنْكِبَيْنِ له شعر إلى منكبيه وفي وقت إلى شحمتي أذنيه وفي وقت إلى نصف أذنيه. He's described as being broad-shouldered. He's very broad in his shoulders. His hair was usually to his shoulders. This is the mankab here, right? So his hair was either to his shoulders or to his earlobes, or sometimes as short as the middle of his ears, but never shorter than that usually. The only time that he was recorded to have shortened his hair was during the rites of Hajj and Umrah. This is when he would cut his hair. At that time, in that place, the culture was that men would keep their hair long, usually. And usually men would keep their beards long as well. Some upper class and elitists might shave their beard, but usually the beard and the hair were long. And people took care and took pride in their hair, men and women. And so his hair was no different, alayhi salatu wassalam. It was at its longest to his shoulders and at its shortest to the tips of his ears, alayhi salatu wassalam, or the middle of his ears. And he would not comb his hair out and keep it combed out. He would always have his hair braided, alayhi salatu wassalam. His hair was in dhafa'ir, usually 3 or 4 braids. Now, does this mean that it is the sunnah for a man to keep long hair? This is an issue that goes back to the intention of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? This is an issue that should be referred to his intention, because when we follow and adhere to the ways of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we don't just adhere to the things that he did, but we adhere to the things that he did with the intentions that he had. Right? And this is an important point. So, for instance, in order for us to say a man should grow his hair and should keep his hair long in following the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we would have to couple that with the custom of the time and place that he was living. So, for instance, with regards to the beard, his beard was long, and he kept his beard. He never shaved his beard. And he also commanded that others not shave their beards as well. So if we look at this and examine this sunnah, this trait of the Prophet ﷺ, we can come to a conclusion that no matter what time or place he would have lived in, he would have always had a beard, right? Because he mentions that the beard is part of the fitrah. It's part of the way a man should keep himself. It's part of the natural way Allah created a man. Likewise, he commanded that people keep their beards, and that this is kind of a trait of a Muslim is that the men would keep beards. So we know that this is the Sunnah, and this is something that, regardless of time or place, he would have always kept a beard. So when we grow our beards out in following the Prophet ﷺ, this is following the Sunnah. Now when we look at that issue of him growing his hair and his hair being long, can we use the same formula to arrive to the same conclusion? Meaning, if he had lived in a time or place where men kept their hair short, would he have still kept his hair long in spite of the custom of men in that time and place? And the answer is most likely no. The most likely answer is that he kept his hair long, not because it's necessarily a worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rather, he kept his hair long because that was the custom of men in the time and place he lived and in the era that he lived, alayhi salatu wassalam. If a person wishes to keep his hair long, a man wishes to grow out his hair in following the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that is fine. Only the condition is that it not be something out of the ordinary amongst his Muslim community, his local Muslim community. So if a man were to grow his hair long and put it in braids and say that this is the Sunnah only in a time and place amongst the Muslim community that keep their hair long. The men keep their hair long. If everyone, and it's only women that grow their hair long, usually in that time and place or in that Muslim community in which the person resides, then it would not be the Sunnah for him to grow his hair. Either way, his hair was usually long, and his hair was always covered. He always covered his head with a imama, a turban, or something was always on his head, alayhi salatu wassalam, except in one case, and that is in the rites of Hajj and Umrah. These are the only recorded times when his head was uncovered. So, if we were to look at this in a more practical sense, for our community here, for instance, is it the custom of men to keep their hair long or short? You say short. It's very unusual for a man, in general, amongst us to have long hair. And I'm speaking about the Muslim community. Amongst the non-Muslim community, that's a different situation. But amongst the Muslims, the average Muslim male amongst us, his hair would not go past a certain length. Past that, it's what would be referred to as mulfit lin-nazar. It's something that would draw attention. Something that would draw attention, the person be known by it. And this is contrary to the essence of community. The essence of a Muslim in his community is إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُحِبُّ الْعَبْدَ الْغَنِيَّ التَّقِيَّ الْخَفِيَّ. The Prophet ﷺ says that Allah indeed loves the servant who is wealthy at heart, who is observant and revering of Allah, and who is unnoticed amongst his Muslim brothers and sisters, somebody who fits in. يقول كان كث اللحية. Also we have a وصف من أوصاف النووي رحمه الله تعالى، وهذا الوصف مأخوذ من شمائل الترمذي ومن غيره من حديث أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه أنه وصف لحية النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بالكثث، بأن لحيته كانت كثة، كان كث اللحية، ما معنى كث اللحية؟ الكثوفة في اللحية أن تكون غير دقيقة ولا طويلة ولكن فيها كثافة. He was also described, his beard was described as katha. And what this means is that his beard was neither very straight, the hair of his beard, nor was it very intertwined and very thick. His beard was similar to his hair texture in that it was medium. It could neither be described as being very thick, and nor could it be described as being very thin and straight. It was between that. And his beard was neither described as being fine, the hair texture, nor coarse, just like the hair of his head, nor was it extremely long. His beard was not extremely long. His beard was described as تَمْلَأُ صَدْرَهُ, that his beard was rich, it was lush, it would fill his chest, but it wasn't considered to be extremely long. It wasn't down to his navel or something of that sort. يقول وكان شثن الكفين، أي يقول النووي أي غليظ الأصابع. شثن الكفين أي غليظهما، وهو مدح في الرجل لأنه أشد لقبضهم. So his fingers were described as being very thick and very masculine. He had big hands, and likewise his fingers were considered to be girthy. And this is something which was a positive trait and considered a trait of elegance in a man, that he would have very strong hands. ضخم الرأس والكراديس. الكراديس جمع، والكراديس هي رؤوس العظام، أطراف العظام. يعني كانت بنيته عليه الصلاة والسلام كبيرة، وكان ذا هيبة عليه الصلاة والسلام، ضخم الرأس والكراديس. As well, he was considered to have a sizable head, and his bone structure, he was kind of big boned. He was big boned, meaning that he had a large frame, عليه الصلاة والسلام. يقول في وجهه تدوير أدعج العينين طويل أهدابهما. وهذه رواية حسنها بعض الحفاظ، ومعنى أدعج العينين أي شديد سواد العينين. عليه الصلاة والسلام. This is a narration which some of the scholars have disputed, but when it comes to characteristics of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, these are usually things which are well known and well documented. One of the descriptions of his face and his head is that his face was more round. You know, some people kind of usually have two facial types, either a round face or a long face, right? And some people add a third type as well. But usually people are somewhere between that, either a very round face or a very long face and straight. His face was not very round, right? Rather, it was more round than it was straight. So, في فرق أن يقال بأن وجهه مدور أو في وجهه تدوير. في وجهه تدوير يعني في وجهه ميول إلى التدوير أكثر من الميول إلى الوجه الذي كالسيف طولا. Likewise, he was described as أدعج العينين, meaning that the circle, the area between the white and the dark part of his iris was very black, very deep. So his eyes were very defined, very white with very black eyes. أحمر المآقي. He was as well described as being ذا مسربة وهي الشعر الدقيق من الصدر إلى السرة كالقضيب. He was also described as having hair on his chest and hair between his chest and his navel, right? And this is the hair that is continuous from the chest on a man and is continuous all the way to the navel. He had this, but he wasn't very hairy, extremely hairy, nor was he completely hairless on his torso. Rather, the hair on his chest was there, and he had a defined hairline that reached from his chest to his navel, عليه الصلاة والسلام. إذا مشى تقلع كأنما ينحط في صبب أي يمشي بقوة والصبب الحضور. ويقول إذا مشى تقلع. قلع الشيء الواحد يسحب الشيء بشدة. فإذا تصورت معي واحد مثلا ماشي في الطين كيف يكون شديد رفع القدم، فهو مثلت مشيته بهذا. فإذا مشى تقلع أي مشى بقوة وجد. He's also described as his walking. When he would walk, he'd be very authoritative in the way that he would walk. It would almost be like a march, alayhi salatu wassalam. And he would walk very intensely. He was never described as being someone who would kind of wander when he walks or walk with his body loose and having a lot of movement between his upper and lower body. Rather, his body would be closer to that of a marching body when he would walk, and he would walk very intensely. He wouldn't be looking around all over the place as if he wasn't sure where he was going, or he just has time to kill, this kind of walking. Rather, he would walk very intensely. عليه الصلاة والسلام. يتلألأ وجهه تلألؤ القمر ليلة البدر. سبحان الله. ابن القيم رحمه الله تعالى في زاد المعاد علق على هذه، أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا مشى تقلع كأنما ينحط من صبب في صبب أي يمشي بقوة. وعلق وقال هذه مشية تدل على كمال عقله عليه الصلاة والسلام. كان لا يكثر الالتفات، وإنما كان إذا مشى إلى منتهى واضحة، وهذا يدل على كمال العقل. Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah in Zadul-Ma'ad, when mentioning this feature or this description of how the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would walk, he would walk with intention. He would walk very intensely, authoritatively, more of a march than it was a walk. And he connected this and took this as one of the things that signify the depth of his mind, alayhi salatu wassalam. Meaning that when he would walk, he would not be walking and looking around all over the place. And he describes this in Zadul-Ma'ad as being the walk of someone who has somewhere to go, someone who is a person of depth and intellect. And he describes the walk of a person who is kind of wandering, very loose, looking around, as this being a sign, especially amongst the Arabs at that time, a sign of simpleness in the mind. He says, يَتَلَأْلَأُ وَجْهُهُ تَلَأْلُأَ الْقَمَرِ لَيْلَةَ الْبَدْرِ. His face would almost light up and almost glisten like that of the full moon. كَأَنَّ وَجْهَهُ الْقَمَرِ. In many descriptions of the companions, his face was described and likened to that of the full bright moon. حسن الصوت. He had a very beautiful voice. سهل الخدين ضليع الفم. سهل الخدين. His cheeks were very smooth. ضليع الفم. سواء البطن والصدر. So he was described as well as having a sizable mouth. It wasn't very small, nor was it freakishly big, but it was sizable. Very masculine features. And likewise, his body was very average in the sense that he didn't have a belly that protruded past his chest, nor a chest which came past his stomach. His chest and stomach were all straight. أشعر المنكبين والذراعين وأعالي الصدر. يعني المنكبين هنا الشعر على يديه وكذلك على الصدر أعالي الصدر هنا. He was described as having hair on the upper part of his chest and starting from his shoulders down عليه الصلاة والسلام. وإذا قلت أشعر في لغة العرب كلمة أشعر على وزن أفعل، هذه صيغة إيش؟ صيغة مبالغة. أشعر يعني كثير الشعر، هنا على الصدر وهنا على المنكبين والذراعين. وهذا كان في العرب من أوصاف الرجال الأقوياء، وأن هذا الشعر يعني كلما ازدادت صفات الرجل وبعدت عن صفات المرأة فإنها كانت مديحة في الرجل. He was likewise described as having hair on his upper torso above his chest. Likewise, the hair on his arms would start from his upper arms and go down. And he was described as having thick or noticeable, bold hair on his arms. And this is, in his time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Arabs at that time, at that place, they appreciated a man and his descriptions. The more contrasted a man's descriptions were from that of a woman's descriptions, this was considered to be more favorable. So a man who was epitomizing masculinity in his features, this was considered very attractive. Likewise, a woman who was epitomizing femininity in her features, this was considered to be something very beautiful. They were the furthest people from androgynous tastes, right? blurring the lines between male and female. This is something that was considered to be very lowly in the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's time, not just amongst the Muslims, but amongst the non-Muslims as well. And it was hence a moral obligation upon men and women, Muslim men and women, to define themselves from the opposite gender, right? There's a narration in Sunnah al-Bayhaqi, Sunnah al-Kubra al-Bayhaqi, rahimahullah, بإسناد جيد, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was accepting the allegiance of a woman that was accepting Islam. And he would accept a man's allegiance if a man came to become Muslim and pledge allegiance to Allah and His Messenger. He would take his hand in his hand and repeat after him whatever the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would tell him. I pledge to command the good and forbid the evil. I pledge to defend the weak. Whatever it is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam found appropriate for this person to say. And one time, a woman wished to pledge allegiance, and when it would be a woman, he wouldn't take her hand. He would take his own hand, and she would clasp her hands together and repeat after him. فرأى يد امرأة وقال يد رجل أم امرأة. يدها كان إيش؟ كان مثل يد الرجل. وقال يد رجل أم امرأة؟ قالت امرأة. قال لها اختضبي. اختضبي. Meaning that this woman, she had done this and to pledge allegiance to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam from behind a curtain. And when she poked out her arm, he asked, is this the arm of a man or a woman? Meaning that her arm was very masculine. It was undefined. And she said, I am a woman. He said, اختضبي, meaning use henna and do henna on your hands and on your arms in order to further define yourself from the opposite gender. لذلك النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قعد قاعدة فقال لعن الله المتشبهين من الرجال بالنساء والمتشبهات من النساء بالرجال ولعن عليه الصلاة والسلام الرجلة من النساء يعني المرأة التي فيها أوصاف الرجل التي هي خاصة في الرجل ولا تليق بالمرأة. For this reason, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam gave us a clear principle with regards to defining the genders. Defining the genders, clearly defining the difference between a man and a woman. He said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the curse of Allah is upon a man who imitates women and a woman who imitates men. There's a line of difference between men and women. The further away the two genders are from this line, the more praiseworthy they are. And the closer people are to this defining line, the less praiseworthy they are. So clear definitions must be had between men and women. يقول رحمه الله تعالى وكان طويل الزندين رحب الراحة. وطويل الزندان هما عظم الذراعين. فكان طويل الزندين عليه الصلاة والسلام. فعظم الذراع كان طويلا، وكان رحب الراحة، وهذا اختلف العلماء فيه أهو وصف خلقي أم خلقي. بعض العلماء قال رحب الراحة كناية عن الجود والعطاء. Likewise, he was described as having very defined and longer forearms. Likewise, he was considered to be very giving. كان عليه الصلاة والسلام أشكل العينين، أي طويل شقهما العين، منهوس العقبين، أي قليل لحم العقب. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was further described here in Bukhari and Muslim, was further described as being someone with wide eyes. His eyes were big and wide and very white. Usually the size of a person's eyes would also articulate the amount of white that there would be in their eyes. So in some narrations he's described as having a lot of white in his eyes. Other descriptions will come in the form of very large eye sockets. All these descriptions are saying the same thing essentially, and that is that he had big eyes, alayhi salatu wassalam. Likewise, he was منهوس العقبين. العقب في لغة الصحابة رضي الله عنهم، العقب عندهم بمنزلة الكعب عندنا احنا بنقول الكعب في لغتنا فلسطين، نقول الكعب في الشام بمعنى العقب في لغة العرب، والكعب في لغة الرسول صلى الله عليه وسلم هو العظم الناتئ على جنبي الساق، يعني مكان ما يتصل الساق بالقدم، واحنا بنقول لها رمانة الرجل، بعرفش. على كل حال هو كان صلى الله عليه وسلم قليل لحم العقب. He was not described as having huge heels or huge feet. Rather, he was described as having thinner heels and feet. بين كتفيه خاتم النبوة أو خاتم النبوة كزر الحجلة وكبيضة الحمامة. Also, he had the seal of the prophets, the seal of prophethood, between his shoulder blades, alayhi salatu wassalam. This seal of prophethood, what is this? This was described by Salman, it was described by Anas, it was described by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, different descriptions. When people would send a letter, especially an important letter or from one king to another, they would have a seal, right? What is this seal? They would take wax and heat it up, and they would heat this wax on this letter or this paper, and then they would take their stamp and their seal, and they would print it, and it would print onto the wax. This is called a seal, right? And the point of a seal is to articulate that this is official. Only one person has that seal, right? The Prophet ﷺ had a seal. It was his ring. So when he started sending letters to inviting the leaders of different nations to Islam and different kingdoms to Islam, he was advised to have a blacksmith or a jeweler make him a seal. And his seal said, Muhammad Rasulullah. You could see pictures of it. It's very well known. And so this seal, he would wear it on his ring. And usually, a king or someone of authority, if they have a seal, they would usually keep it on a ring or keep it in a place that was safe, that nobody could access it, and plagiarize something in his name. And so, the seal of prophethood was similar in the way that it looked. It didn't have actual writing on it, letters, but it looked a little bit like that melted wax. And some of the companions described it as to look like about the size of a pigeon's egg or a bird's egg between his shoulder blades, alayhi salatu wassalam. يقول رحمه الله تعالى: وكان إذا مشى كأنما تطوى له الأرض ويجدون في لحاقه وهو غير مكترث عليه الصلاة والسلام. غير مكترث يعني الصحابة يجهدون أنفسهم ليمشوا معه ويلحقوا عليه، وهو غير مكترث يعني مش جاهد نفسه. هذه مشيته، كأن الأرض تطوى من تحته عليه الصلاة والسلام. وهذه أوصاف نأتي إليها في الأسبوع القادم. Inshallah, next week we will continue, finish up these physical descriptions and move on to a collection regarding the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's miracles. This is enough for tonight. Wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in.